why does EPR feel so painful inside of our organizations, and how do we fix it? And what I have been seeing a lot is that EPR kind of falls down or fails. It's not because teams don't care, because we can't learn it. It's because organizations aren't necessarily set up structurally to make these things smooth. So our team has done a tremendous job really going through a tremendous amount of data, polling a lot of organizations that are very, very advanced and far through and at the beginning of their journey to understand the different phases of how they are going through and structuring each different component of how they work towards compliance, breaking that down into what does this actually mean for organizations from a standpoint of time, resourcing, because again, this is kind of new and a lot of people don't necessarily understand, like, is this going to be a couple of hours? The initial setup, what about the ongoing maintenance? So we've broken this down into 5 key phases. The first being data collection. And again, a lot of people start by just assessing liability, reading the laws, gathering initial pieces and parts of data just to try to figure out, okay, do we have what we need? I mean, the reality is the data exists. It's about, do you have enough to get where you need to go? And that could be quite a daunting task. And what we have come away with is that the initial lift is anywhere between 60 and 80 hours. Obviously varies about the reality of your data environment. But additionally, outside of that initial 60 to 80 hour lift, there's about a 40-hour average of time when you have new states, new covered material categories that Svetlana talked about earlier, with California kind of releasing that updated CMC list. So again, we were very shocked to see, just again, whether you're a sophisticated, multi-person, functional kind of driven organization, we still see tens of hours in this initial data collection and setup phase. Phase 2 in the data prep, this is where you're analyzing and normalizing the data formats, trying to QA stuff. Again, the initial lift is a big one. We're talking anywhere between 30 to 50 hours of work for teams to actually normalize and QA, QC, and benchmark a lot of the data. This is where a lot of the documentation for methodology comes into play. And then again, this is going to be an ongoing thing, and you have to understand that this is going to vary state by state as those come on. Now, phase 3 is the categorization and optimization phase, where your team is interpreting the regulations against the data, mapping the materials into those categories, and then hopefully getting legal validation of those interpretations. Now, the initial lift on this is a much higher one, just because you're actually pulling things together, as what we've seen from organizations that we've polled and interviewed. This is about a 50 to 75 hour initial lift for organizations to really put all this into practice. And we've seen on average about 25 to 40 hours of work, additional lift after that initial kind of foundation is put on for those state by state additions. So phase 4 is like the actual work. A lot of things happen behind the scenes, right? The reporting or submitting the report, I guess, is like the only thing that gets seen. So it's kind of interesting. Again, our findings was just how much work goes into getting to this phase 4 of actually getting into the portal and doing all of that work. The reporting phase, let me actually take a look at my notes here. This is a big one. That's why we asked about the polling earlier, because in some cases we've seen anywhere between a 60 and 100 hours of initial build out if they're doing some sort of sophisticated connection or integrating all these different things to a much smaller number. And by that, I mean in the 40 to 60 hours for smaller teams, and maybe a person of one. If they, again, smaller SKU counts, things like that, we're seeing in the realm of 20 hours of work just for the reporting phase. That's after all of that. And what I'm going to show you here in a second is the accumulation of all of this work through these different phases that equate to the actual impact to the business. And again, I think one thing that we really wanted to focus on was the fact that this work is multiplied by the number of states. Again, it's kind of like initial lift. Anything out of the gate is hard, but it's not like we're recreating the wheel, but there is certainly more lift than we thought as we think, and as we watch and interview and talk with companies as they build out these state by state things after the initial framework is put together. So I'm kind of curious. And then there's the ongoing maintenance phase, which could be anywhere between 5 to 10 hours a week, depending on when California launches their final ruling. You're going to see a lot of people spend a lot more time getting themselves to resubmit their 2023 data, get ready for their 2026 early fees, etc. So it will ebb and flow, but the ongoing maintenance is certainly something that I think companies need to keep an eye on. So let's talk about some of the traps and why things tend to go sideways for a lot of teams that we talk to. Well, spreadsheets don't scale. There's double counting. There's a lot of things that happen. The fact is there's more and more and more complexity with things like California and subcomponents, where traditional, I guess, are tried and true things, or maybe some of the things that we learned from Colorado and Oregon, things just begin to break down. Our normal tools, our normal processes just get a little overwhelmed and begin to break. So that's why I said one of the things earlier is to make sure that like you guys have a Svetlana in or around you, whether that's internally or you have to seek that type of person and help outside of your organization. I think it's certainly something that's important, because these are the things that typically get tripped up, whether it's process driven, lack of people, or lack of ability to handle, consume, make sense of, and handle this data, not only from an initial lift and establishment standpoint, but the ongoing requirements thereafter. So like I said earlier, no one is missing all the data. It's just like some of it is living in witness protection, as I like to say. Packaging might have some of this, finance might have some of it, but the fact is it's out there. It's just, we are going to be seeing like a California, very much a compressed timeline. So when you take a look at some of these outputs from our surveys on the time that it has taken actual companies to do the work, that's where you have got to really make some decisions internally. And I'll turn this over. And at the end, you're going to be able to download our resource planning guide. I have seen other organizations charge a tremendous amount of money for these types of resources. So certainly there's a QR code at the end. Make sure you download it. There is some incredible information in there that I think can help you talk about, socialize, and normalize some of these conversations internally. But this slide really just says that the data exists, so don't act like it doesn't. It's about your ability to go find it, consume it, normalize it, match it up to make it do the work that you need it to do to stay in compliance. I always like to say that perfect data is a fantasy, and defensible data is the goal, or defensible data is how you're going to be able to sleep at night if you are solely responsible for EPR. Now, like I said, the data does exist, but it's not going to be perfect. It just has to do what we need it to do. And I like to say, like, when you look at number 3, centralize your packaging data in a structured, searchable system that can run calculations across geographies. You might be thinking, well, what do you mean? My point is, if your system, your process can't answer what has changed in the last year about how much of a specific material, like if you can't query and maneuver that data, that's not a system, that's a filing cabinet. And a filing cabinet is not going to get you where you need to go when it comes to these initial EPR rulings, but also there is more coming. So establishing a very strong foundation with deep and secure pilings to build upon is so wildly important now that we have some actual data about what it takes organizations to do it. And here it is, right? So why I asked about some of you and the SKUs that your company has, there are a lot of overwhelming majority of you on this call that have between 250 and 2,000 SKUs. So what we have seen, and again, there are always outliers. If you're a big fan of Malcolm Gladwell like I am, you could read his book. We know that a standard distribution curve, and there's always going to be edge cases. But in general, for those of you that have up in this larger bracket, we're talking 2 to 4 full-time employees to actually resource this properly to go across all 5 of those phases and get you where you need to get for compliance. Now, a good majority of you are in that middle bracket, and I'm sure some of the smaller ones, I think we had about 15% or so that were in the small range. I would love to get feedback to see if what we have been pulling from the market and interviews and surveys is matching up to what you're feeling or what you feel is going to be the reality as you move through those phasic approaches that we talked about. Now, again, obviously, right, you have Repurpose over here that has been working in sustainability globally, making our impact known for a number of years, but we've certainly pivoted into helping brands, given the immense amount of packaging data that we have handled over the years, into a kind of one size beautiful platform with one flat fee, all reports are covered. Like what we're finding is that through technology and automation and leveraging the amazing time that we're living in, we can offset or become a very, very, very important component of an initial, interim, or long-term EPR compliance strategy, both here and soon, obviously, in some of the Canadian provinces, and for some of you larger, more global companies, as you dance with PPWR and other regulations overseas.